Good afternoon and welcome to the Energy Transition Hub for our Tuesday afternoon session on day 10 of COP. So it is day 10, we'll try and keep the energy up, but it's been an eventful couple of weeks so far, and obviously a lot of focus on the climate crisis, a lot of focus on renewable energy and its role in it. And today's session is about developing renewable energy in harmony with people and nature. And our government and our Prime Minister has been quite strong and quite bold in saying we don't just have a climate crisis in the world, we have a nature crisis as well. And therefore doing what we do in harmony with nature is becoming increasingly important. So we've assembled a really esteemed panel of guests to join me here today. And before I introduce them, I just wanted to reflect on some work that Renewable UK have been doing this year. We've been doing some polling, particularly working in the field of onshore wind. And in that polling, we found some quite interesting information. Not simply that, when projects are being taken through the development stage and developers are talking to communities, people aren't just concerned about the size of the turbines, they're not just concerned about the jobs that are being created, but they're really fundamentally concerned with two things. First of all, are the turbines being put in the right places? Is this being done sympathetic to the environment that it's in? And is this the right thing for the local environment and nature? And those two sort of fundamental points really came out of our polling. So we wanted to explore this subject in some detail with the panel. So I've been joined today by Grant Douglas, who's joining us. He's a Senior Planning and Environmental Policy Manager for Scottish Power Renewables. Alan Duckworth, who's working on, who's a project manager for the Offshore Wind Deployment Scenarios 2050 and doing some quite important work with the government, and joining us from Arup. We've got Sam Oxley, who's Board Director for Landscape Planning from Land Use Consultants. John Lethamith, who's joining us from, who's the Global Head of Public Affairs and joins us from Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy, and James Barry, who's the CEO of Renewable Parts. So we're going to go through and talk to each one of our panelists individually on their specific areas, get their reflections, and then we'll come back for a bit of a conversation towards the end of the session. So I'm going to start with you, Grant. First of all, thanks for joining us. Obviously you work for one of the most notable developers of renewable energy in the UK, clearly here in Scotland. I think your headquarters are just over the river behind us. Could you maybe give us a little bit of a reflection on, what it's like from your perspective as a developer, how you work with communities to take into account the environment and nature, and how and what those conversations are like and how that's evolving?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Dan. So Scottish Power Renewables is obviously part of Scottish Power. So we've really been leading both in terms of renewable development, but in terms of our transition to 100% green. So in 2018, we've been 100% green with no thermal generation. And obviously as part of Scottish Power being part of Iberdrola, so we have that global understanding. Iberdrola have a commitment to reach net zero by 2050. So recently, in terms of our investment, we are seeking to invest about 3.7 billion up to 2025 in renewable projects here in the UK. Mm-hmm. We've also announced a further 6 billion investment in our East Anglia hub project offshore. In terms of what we do and what we're about as a company and the projects that we're really getting our teeth into now, and maybe the future of the market for us, I reflect on our Whiteley wind farm, which is 2 minutes up the road near COP. But for us, we refer to that as an energy park now. And for us, it's a park in the true sense of the word. And my background as a town planner, it's been really exciting working on that project. It's been about energy, but it's also been about placemaking. So in terms of the energy mix within that park, I think if you take Whiteley, it's about the size and the footprint of the whole of Glasgow where we are today. So it's a massive facility, and it's on everybody's doorstep, right next to the busiest part of Scotland, but it's really become part of the community. So we've now won a Green Flag Award for that. So as a park, thousands of visitors visit Whiteley every month. So people taking their children to learn to ride bikes, walking around the park, cycling through the park. Within the energy mix, within that, we're also looking to promote solar, hydrogen, battery storage. So it's a real mix of energy. And we'll also be looking at how that park reacts to needs in terms of the grid. So it's an energy park for us, but it's also become a park in terms of the community. It's become part of the community. Within that mix as well, we have a huge peak restoration projects. So for us, that's really about taking all the elements of what we do and delivering them in one site, and it's really about that placemaking at scale.
Can I ask you to explore a little bit about the human side of that? Because I mean, that term placemaking is, I mean, it's not something you hear an awful lot. We often come from, you know, the utility industry. We're building power stations. You know, this is quite an interesting angle. When you're talking to people now about, you know, hydrogen, solar, storage, bringing different technologies into it, are people defensive about change in that, or are they more open to it?
Yeah, I mean, as a place, Whiteley's really been adopted into the hearts of the communities round about Glasgow, so all the corrugations round about. I think my wife was there with her parents on Sunday. We frequently go walk the dog, so it's it's become a place for people to visit, and there happens to be wind turbines there and other pieces of infrastructure. So yeah, certainly there'll be challenges. You know, we may come to repower that site in the future, and there'll be real challenges there in terms of people's ownership and how they feel connected to that area and where changes happen. And we've dealt with that recently, but I think the way we've tried to deal with that is to engage with members of the public, engage in different ways, get out there and talk to people who are visiting the facility. So yeah, for us it's really all about how we continue to engage with the people that use the park.
And has that changed the way you think about community engagement in general, like, you know, in other sites and in other parts of the country?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's taken us away from thinking about, you know, we're building this static facility that does energy, puts energy on the bars, and it's more about being part of people's community. So not every wind farm and every wind farm site is going to be a Whiteley, but there are benefits in terms of the community that each site can offer. So it's about looking at each site on its merits and the role it might play in terms of the communities that are around about it.
And I mean, when you started that process on Whiteley, I mean, it was a number of years ago now. It's very well established. Was that something that you envisaged at the beginning, or is it something that's just evolved kind of naturally since?
I think it's probably evolved over time, and there were certainly aspirations to develop that network at such a large site, and it connects up different parts of Glasgow. So there were certainly aspirations to do something, but I don't think we could have dreamed it would be quite as popular. I think there must be about 7,000 visitors a month, perhaps. There's a visitor centre there, so it's evolved over time. There are other sites that we're looking at that may play a different role in terms of public access, so cycling, for example. There are other sites we look at that may be more focused in terms of biodiversity and enhancement around that local area. And there are sites we look at that may play more of a financial contribution in terms of community benefit in local areas. So yeah, it's really about understanding how the site might affect the local communities round about, and not trying to lay over our preconceptions over what the community might want from it.
So there's a part of me thinks that just generally in the industry we're not terrific at telling the story of this kind of stuff, and that, you know, perhaps still within society at large we're not necessarily getting the recognition for doing, you know, for creating such an environment that people can access and benefit from.
Yeah.
What do you think we should be doing as an industry more to tell that story?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time we've shied away from talking about our facilities. We have this notion that public perception is against any sort of change in the landscape, and that's probably reinforced by a small minority, I would say, who shout the loudest. But I think it's really about trying to grasp those positive aspects and trying to lever the discussion with a much wider demographic of people and a much more holistic discussion about these sites. I think there's now an acceptance that wind farms are part of the landscapes of the future. I think there needs to be change across the landscape industry as to how it addresses that change over time. But I think we all need to play a role in that discussion. So yeah, absolutely. we've become better, I think, about trying to, rather than shy away and stay away from that discussion, be awful defensive about that discussion. We've become a lot better now at trying to lever those positives and trying to discuss other aspects of what we do with communities.
Yeah, and I think from our point of view in Renewable UK, we're certainly seeing that you know, that part of that polling that I referred to earlier shows that you know, society at large, and whether it's in Scotland, England, or Wales, or Northern Ireland, there are very high levels of public support for further onshore wind development, and you know, people who live close to wind farms generally quite appreciate them, and you know, that old myth of the closer you get, the lower the support is actually not factually correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think the poll you referred to, I think, shows up to kind of 70% support for onshore wind, which is a great statistic, and that probably reflects in how we go through the planning process. For us, I think the planning process has a role to play in becoming less adversarial around new development and encouraging everybody to take a role, not just the kind of, as I say, the vocal minority. I think it needs to encourage a faster, more efficient process. And you know, we can start doing that through some of the policy changes that are occurring just now in England with the National Policy Statement, in Scotland with the National Planning Framework. So I think there's a role for us all to play. Yeah, and certainly I think the point you made earlier, which is a really good one, it still has to be about the right development in the right place. We have a role to play as an industry in making sure we are promoting the right development in the right place.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm gonna come on to you, Alan, in terms of the thinking about the offshore environment. You know, talked a lot there about Whiteley, and that's really a nice place to start because it's so local here to Glasgow. But you know, moving a little bit into the offshore world, and you know, perhaps ironically, the offshore sector grew so quickly in the UK because it didn't face the same kind of immediate planning challenges, or at least let's say visual impacts, but a whole host of different nature challenges. And not only nature challenges, we go forward now with the ambitions we've got in the UK, it's also about using the space. I mean, we're going to have 100 gigawatts or more of offshore wind by 2050. That's going to, you know, where are we going to put all these wind farms? And I know you've been doing a lot of work thinking about exactly that question, so maybe you could share, you know, a little bit what Arup has been doing on the future offshore wind scenarios.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Dan. I think I can get the slides up, that'd be great. Thank you very much. My name's Alan Duckworth. I'm the UK IMAA Strategy and Finance and Economics lead in offshore wind within Arup. Firstly, yeah, thanks to Renewable UK for inviting me along. It's great to be back. I used to actually work in this office before, whereas my desk used to be almost here. So the view out the window, it used to be my daily view.
So the memories of flooding back.
Exactly, yeah, doing technical siting analysis for onshore wind, which started my career in renewables development about 15 years ago. So today, I'll be talking about a data-driven approach that to looking at how the future offshore wind scenarios might develop out to 2050. So at Arup, we're a firm of 15,000 designers, planners, engineers, and consultants working across the globe. We work across 7 energy sectors, with offshore wind as a key part of our renewables business. We've got a track record for providing strategic advisory, technical due diligence services, and design for clients across the offshore wind industry. We work with clients across the globe as well, so ranging from the east coast of the US through the more developing markets across Australia and the APAC regions. So today, I'm here to talk about our future offshore wind scenarios project. So as you mentioned there, the context behind it is, you know, the Prime Minister has stated we're going to develop 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, but looking further into the future, where to meet the net zero targets, we're going to need much more than 40 gigawatts. And so you mentioned more than 100 gigawatts, but for example, say 140 gigawatts, where where and how is that feasible, and what are the challenges we're facing when we try to address that. So Arup's been appointed by BEIS, the UK government's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And part of this project, so the project is part of the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme, whose mission is to facilitate the sustainable and coordinated expansion of offshore wind to help meet the UK commitments to the energy transition while supporting clean, healthy and productive biologically diverse seas. That's led by the Crown Estate, and as a group, the BEIS, we're working directly with BEIS, the Crown Estate Scotland on this project. During the project, we've engaged with a wealth of stakeholders across the sector, from NGOs, government bodies, utilities, developers, to try to inform some of the inputs into our modelling. So I'll try to explain what it is we've been doing. The research tries to define a range of scenarios for the deployment of offshore wind, and to provide a greater understanding of the balance between the technical, economic, environmental and system considerations, and the interaction between all these things and the ability to meet the net zero targets that the UK ambition is. We've been working closely in partnership with the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, who've been providing some support, and marine consultancy ABP Mayor to develop these scenarios. And we've developed a data-driven model to visualize these cost and spatial considerations in an interactive and geospatial format. The project has been centered around 3 main net zero pathways. So looking at 65 gigawatt installation, 95 gigawatt install capacity, and 140 to give a range of scenarios. These are in line with the CCC's 6th carbon budget, and within those pathways, we're developing a number of spatial considerations and sensitivities across the system factors, and then looking out temporally across the time domain into the future. So we've developed an approach that brings together the levelized cost of energy modelling along with the key geospatial considerations and system sensitivities. And I guess applicable to this session that we're in today, the discussion is around the fact that the project builds on previous marine spatial planning exercises that have been carried out by the Crown Estate and Marine Scotland. This project somewhat differs from those approaches because we're not doing marine spatial planning. We're looking at sort of treating everything equally, all the geospatial considerations, and within the tools we built, we have the ability to categorize and change how we allocate those, I guess, and how we balance those against the trade-offs in levelized cost of energy. So the model, as well as balancing LCOE and the geospatial considerations, then moves forward through the time domain to essentially year on year, based on the set of inputs we give it, dispatch wind farms in various locations around the seabed. And so, yeah, we've run various geospatial modelling, taking into account the system and temporal sensitivities. We're in the process of finalising the report, so we haven't actually published anything yet, so I can't really go into the results. Yeah, so we're hoping towards the end of the year or early next year we'll have finalised the analysis and worked through with the client group, BEIS, the Crown Estate, Crown Estate Scotland, so there's some outputs that we can share. The outputs will also be shared in an interactive dashboard where people can play around with various scenarios and turn things on and off. So that's the end goal, let's say. And just to flag that the work has been delivered using our in-house digital scale tool, which is essentially, it allows us to automate the engineering process through the concept, the site concept stage, providing LCOE for any given site to support relative comparison of sites. also applicable to this session is the fact that we've recently partnered with the World Bank Group, and we've published lead authors supported by BBG Associates in providing input into this, what's been called the Bible of offshore wind development factors. The study we worked on pulls together lessons learned from all the mature markets and a series of case studies that condense their lessons, with a focus on today's panel, I guess. The relevance being that in this report we set out some key factors for how policymakers should consider approaches to environmental social impact assessments and to marine spatial planning in order to encourage offshore wind development, but not essentially at the cost of the environment, and making sure that the policies are robust and ultimately leads that the frameworks are robust enough and leads to bankable offshore wind projects which account for interface with the environment and the people. So yeah, those are the slides I have, and that's a bit of a background to the project.
Thanks, Alan. And I mean, while harnessing my inner Jeremy Paxman, I feel like I know you can't tell us anything about the results of the findings, but you know, I do want to press you a little bit on what happens in the 140 gigawatt scenario, and you know, do you find how are you finding the sort of the complexities of space trade-off versus LCOE? Are there any early indications you can give us?
Yeah, so it's very dependent on how we handle the geospatial considerations in those pathways. So we can go across different dimensions, and if we treat a range of the geospatial considerations as very hard type constraints, where the model tries hard to avoid dispatching sites into those locations, then we do sort of end up with some clustering of sites, and it essentially, what we're presenting is not realistic marine spatial planning, and it's not giving realistic locations for sites. So it's about just understanding, as we turn things on and off, what that's telling us about how it's driving the potential cost of deployment. Another key learning is really around how that's pushing us potentially into deeper waters to deploy floating offshore wind. So a key output of the modelling will be to determine kind of a tipping point between the fixed bottom and the floating foundation sites, and how then that affects the global levelised cost of energy. We do see that floating is coming into play in all scenarios, which I guess is probably expected as the industry develops around that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the sense is that floating is going to come a lot faster than we realise with ScotWind, and you know, we're going to start to encounter some of those the sort of the differences in the environmental impacts of that, or comparative environmental impacts of that, sooner rather than later. I guess just one last question on offshore, which is that, you know, obviously the UK's gone faster than any other country. You've obviously written, you know, the Bible, as you called it, of recommendations. You know, are there any specific lessons that you would pull out from the development of the UK's offshore wind industry that, you know, if we're talking to people here at COP from other countries who are interested and are, you know, thinking about developing offshore wind markets, especially now floating wind is coming forward, you know, that you would say you've really got to remember this? Yeah,
so a few things that have struck me through the couple of projects I mentioned were really around the need to have those clear frameworks in place around the planning process. It needs to be robust and lead to the ability for projects to get permitted, and those permits being robust to ensure that investors and developers have confidence in that process, that the permits don't end up falling away later in the process, and to sort of start that process, I think a looking at marine spatial planning in a kind of pragmatic and proportionate manner, so you can kind of get the industry moving and make sure you're accounting for the key factors in where you're going to put your wind farms, essentially.
Yeah.
And I guess the other key thing is that the trade-offs we're talking about, and we mentioned at the start of they can't, net zero is a key target that we're working towards, but it can't be at the cost of all other environmental factors.
Absolutely.
And so there's a balance and a trade-off between the two, and it's got to be considered throughout. Really.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Alan. I'm going to come Sam back over to you and talk a little bit more about onshore wind. And I think first of all, if maybe switch our focus a little bit back to onshore and share a little bit of some of the work that you've been doing and some of the key findings that you have in your work.
Okay, I'm Sam Oxley and I work for a long-established environmental consultancy called Land Use Consultants, LUC, and I've been there, 15 years or so, and I suppose throughout my time in LUC I've been really engaged in all sorts of renewables, but onshore wind in particular. I'm a landscape architect, and so my key area of interest is around impacts on the landscape and on people. Although obviously have a wider remit in terms of also thinking about peat, nature conservation, and the whole remit of environmental issues that needs to be considered for through environmental impact assessment. And I suppose my experience is that we're always working really hard with developers to try and make the absolute best out of projects, and that's not just from a renewable energy generation perspective. It's also about the legacy we can leave in terms of peat restoration, improved nature conservation value, so restoring habitats linked closely obviously to peat, legacies of pathways or tree planting, or just that a whole plethora of additional environmental benefits. And essentially these are often very large sites, often in upland environments, often that classic kind of Montbier's sheep desert, maybe wild land, or not classified as wild land, but land that's heavily grazed by deer. There's not that much there apart from heather, degraded sphagnum, degraded peat and such like. So that's something that we really, really want to bring to every project. And because they're such big areas of land, often these can be real benefits. So from a sort of environmental perspective and considering landscape, nature and people, from the outset we often start by helping with site search for developers. So obviously we'll plug in a whole load of criteria, but it's all about trying to avoid environmental effects from the outset. So we might look at 100 different sites and then whittle that down to, say, the 5 best that avoid impacts on people, avoid impacts on nature conservation, or indeed offer substantial opportunities to improve upon those positions. From that site search stage, we typically move forward to provide feasibility studies, again environmentally focused rather than technically based. And I, for example, would be looking at ways to further reduce landscape and visual effects. So I'll frequently flag a site to a developer as being very high risk and perhaps not one to take forward, whereas others I'll look and think, well, there's there is real opportunity. This could be another Whiteley. We could have a network of connected places. We can plant, we can restore peat, we can do all of these things in tandem with developing what we might call a renewable energy landscape. So not just a wind landscape, but as Grant was talking about earlier, the potential for hydrogen, for solar, for energy storage, all within one site. And we'll we'll work closely with developers to try and find the best places for different parts of their projects within the chosen sites. And then we'll move on to the detailed environmental impact assessment process, which again is about refining that further. You know, again, finding the best parts of the site for different types of development, or looking at turbine height, or working really hard, perhaps with aviation consultants, to reduce impacts of lighting and reduce impacts. So there's a huge amount of effort goes into developing the sites, not just to maximise renewable energy, or indeed not at all to maximise renewable energy, but to make the renewable energy generation dovetail with the wider benefits, and to reduce the impacts that development might have. So, and increasingly, I suppose in the past couple of years, I've really come round to thinking all developers, everyone who's playing a part in changing our landscape, should be putting a few pieces in the jigsaw in terms of those wider benefits. So we're working on a fantastic project with NatureScot at the moment to develop a development framework. And there are a number, I think 10 different developers also involved, and the local authorities are involved, NatureScot's involved as well. And essentially this framework is going to provide a starting point for everyone to put their bits into the jigsaw. So it might be, you know, provide some funding towards 10 kilometres of a green link, or it might be a piece in a restoration of a peatland, for example. So if everybody is working together to help address the climate emergency through transition to green electricity, and also putting a piece in the jigsaw in terms of nature conservation benefits, landscape benefits and other things, then surely that's a much better way to be spending our time and our money than having expensive fights at public inquiries, paying lots of lawyers and putting that money somewhere where it's not actually benefiting the environment. So that's really where I'm pushing forward at the moment.
Absolutely, and you know, I love all of Renewable UK's members from the legal profession, but I'm sure everyone would agree we're best spending money on that. I mean, one of the things that's sort of in my mind is that as we look forward, you talked about that process of, you know, filtering the sites and finding the optimum site. But as we go forward, and we're advocating in Renewable UK for 30 gigawatts of onshore wind by 2030. You know, surely the sites that, you know, on the initial search were, you know, in the sort of the ones that you removed. At some point, they have to come into the conversation. And then there's an added dimension, which is that technology is moving forward. There is the pressure to reduce costs, you know, just in terms of it being the right thing to do, but also, you know, in light of what we've heard this year around, you know, the increasing cost of electricity, so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on that equation 5 years from now, when tip heights are at 200 metres and we're going through the more difficult sites?
Well, of course that's true. Many will say the easiest sites have been taken, but also, you know, as you say, also technology has changed massively. So if you look back, for example, to old projects in Wales, we had serried rows of little turbines, all in lines along the tops of the ridges. Mm-hmm. They were, I don't know, 40, 50 metres high, but arguably in some ways a greater visual impact, because there are lots and lots of turbines all kind of going like this, very busy, very cluttered. So now we're obviously moving to these much bigger turbines. They almost, to use Mark van Grieken's words, transcend the landscape. They're high above, the world can go on beneath, they're much more widely spaced. The sites themselves take more land, so you know there's more opportunity beneath. So I think we have to, you know, recognise the challenge, yes, that we're moving to more difficult sites, but we're looking at different things. And so, you know, we face current days challenges and opportunities, really.
Absolutely. But on the plus side, the public attitudes have shifted. I mean, at least the evidence that we see suggests that, in the last 5 to 10 years, solar, wind development in general is more supported across the demographics.
Absolutely.
Do you think that the climate association is getting through to people, and that's
I think the younger generations are growing up as well. I mean, certainly my children and nephews in my family they don't think about visual impact. They see turbines as normal, and these people are now getting to working age and starting to work through the population. So, when we first saw big electricity transmission pylons in the landscape in, what was it, 60s or wherever, Grant will tell me, people were horrified by these things because they were new.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting looking back and reading a few old papers. But now people don't really talk about the size of those structures, but we're all still talking about the size of wind turbines. But that's because they're still relatively new. But, we have now had, 10, 15 years of these big structures in the landscape, and the generations growing up with them, and, school kids, teenagers, and now university students probably are an awful lot more positive about them than the older generations. And of course, they can be extremely convincing for their parents and grandparents beyond as well.
Are those younger generations, or are those mindsets starting to find their way into the planning authorities of local councils, do you find?
It's a very mixed picture. But I'm sure that there's a lot better understanding now of the need to balance. Yeah. Of course there are visual impacts, of course there are landscape impacts. There's much more acceptance that, on one side of the scales you've got these impacts, on the other side you've got these benefits. And, I suppose the impacts are better understood.
Yeah.
The balancing is better understood now.
And of course, in all of that, I mean, it's not just about the impacts, it's also about all what you were saying at the beginning, which is about actually all of the good work that goes into making sure that these schemes are environmentally positive, rather than, so that it's not just a mitigation, it goes beyond the mitigation to having a real long-lasting impact.
Yeah, and there's potential for these sites to become research sites and such like as well. And again, we're learning a lot from longer-running studies now.
Thanks, Sam. And talking of research projects, John, I want to come to you because I think you represent one of the biggest suppliers or OEMs in the industry. Supply chain sustainability is a topic of conversation which is becoming increasingly relevant. So you've announced this work on recyclable blades, and the whole conversation around recyclable blades has been really topical this year. So do you want to share with us what Siemens Gamesa have been doing and tell us about the process?
Thank you very much, Dan, and a pleasure. Thank you also to Renewables UK to give us Siemens Gamesa the opportunity to be with these high-level panelists to discuss with this fantastic view just behind us. And I think we all are coming from COP, and hopefully some positive discussions will end in positive outcomes also by the end of the week. Pleased to share, yes, we have been, I'm representing Siemens Gamesa, as you were rightly pointing out, one of the global leaders in the wind sector, one of the pioneers also in the wind sector. And I think I would like to grandfather what you were saying related to the public acceptance of wind. I think people have started to, under the climate, I prefer to talk about climate emergency rather than climate change. So under the current climate emergency situation we are living, and the momentum, I think that people have realized that wind is the solution. So it is not the problem, it's the solution. The only one fighting against wind turbines or windmills was Quixote many years ago, and he thought that it was giants. They were they were generating energy, but now we are generating clean energy, and related to the recyclable project on a green way. So this is not only about maximizing the landscape. This is not about generating green energy. This is doing in a sustainable way. Proud of the announcement made back in early September, where we announced the first of its kind offshore wind recyclable blade. not only announcing, but we have already manufactured 2 sets of rotors, which is going to be installed in an offshore wind farm in Germany, Kaskasi wind farm for RWE. We are also talking to other customers such as EDF Renewables or WPD, also to give them the opportunity, because this is being offered to our customers, of installing this fully recyclable offshore blade. Why only offshore blade? Because this is being developed only for offshore currently, but we want also to jump into the onshore. In July, we announced at Siemens Gamesa our vision for the sustainability strategy by 2040. We are aiming fully recyclable blades, both offshore and onshore, by 2030. Fully recyclable turbine, not only the blade, but turbine, by 2040. Because we have to take into account that currently nearly between 85 and 95% of the wind turbine is recyclable. The main challenging, let's say, component for recycling is blades, the resins and the composites. So it is not just that we announced having a fully recyclable blade for the future. We are also involved in recycling the current blades that are decommissioned, or you know that it was announced also the landfill ban or requested the landfill ban for wind blades by 2025. So try to foster sustainability in the whole supply chain. And I think we as role models in the industry, utilities, we have to also showcase to the social community how we are engaged also from a sustainability point of view. We became carbon neutral in 2019 at Siemens Gamesa. We have targeted to become net zero by 2040, while before we were targeting 2050, so 10 years ahead. Related to sustainability, we have engaged also, as said, in the recyclable materials with other parties in the supply chain. So this is not about individual companies. So we are very proud of working together. For example, the Decon Blades project, the fiber use. So there are already projects ongoing to deliver not only clean energy, but on a sustainable way.
Thanks, John. And I think, I'm a former employee of Siemens, so I'm going to avoid getting really nerdy about asking how you're doing it and getting into the details. But I am going to ask you about it, sort of the innovation, because being part of a global company, a lot of this requires innovation. A lot of it requires trade-offs. How do you see that unfolding in terms of you're part of this global network of factories and different ideas? How are you harnessing those ideas and making sure that they get back to headquarters and find their way into sort of the plan for the company?
I think we are the global solution for a global challenge, which is climate emergency. I mean, climate change, climate emergency. There is no owner. We are all owners. So this is the reason why we have to be global. For example, the recyclable blade, it was manufactured in Denmark, in our Aalborg blade manufacturing facility, but it will become global. We will be manufacturing in Hull, for example, in our blade manufacturing facility here in the UK, or in France, or in the US. This is a global solution. We just fit from an R&D point of view. We allocate more than 300 million every single year to R&D. This is the reason why we have become so competitive. Renewables. There is no currently any debate about economic feasibility of renewables. This is not about being green. This is about economic profitability. There is no more profitable business currently rather than investing in renewables. And this is thanks to the investment by our customers, by ourselves, and how we trigger all along the supply chain. So, for example, talking about another component, maybe critical materials. If we may speak about critical materials, rare earths. We try to have global supply chains, try to be competitive. Maybe it doesn't despite where it may be developed from an R&D perspective, we take the best practices and we implement overall. We have installed more than 100 gigas in 90 countries. So we deliver a state-of-art technology with all our suppliers anywhere in the world where we work.
But you mentioned something there I was going to ask you on, because it was it's highly relevant. You know, offshore in particular, big focus on direct drive technology.
Yes.
Permanent magnet generators means rare earth materials. How are you holding your supply chain to account for the impact that they make?
I mean, there is not going to be. It is true that hopefully 140 gigas would be installed by 2050 in the UK, more than 100 in many other. I mean, the full potential of offshore wind, not even counting with the maturity of floating offshore wind. So there is a huge market. I don't think there is only one way to approach the critical rare earth materials approach. I think, first of all, with our suppliers' business conduct guidelines, we ensure that the sourcing is sustainable. Second, we develop efficient use of permanent magnets. Also, we use new technological developments to use less rare earth materials. And fourth, I think that also recycling. We have already tested recycling rare earths. If I may, for example, this being the four pillars of the skeleton of our strategy. Recently, well, 1 year ago, by the way, it was recently the first anniversary of the European Rare Earth Materials Alliance. I think we became part of them in June, and they follow the same strategy. They want to amplify the sourcing, so we consider that maybe Europe, the US, maybe Australia also could be developing together with China other mining capabilities for sourcing rare earth materials. We would also like to, let's say, maybe foster the elimination and removal of trade barriers for clean components, because as said, climate emergency is global, so there shouldn't be any trade barriers for protecting the global good. And also protecting sustainability, sustainable supply chain, and developing new technologies and making our turbines and materials more efficient.
Thanks, John. And really, it's a complex network of things that comes into making those magnificent machines. So it's great to hear about all the work that's going on. James, a completely different angle that you come from, because you're coming from from the circular economy angle, basically. Tell us a bit about renewable parts, what you see as being the sort of the big opportunities to do more with what we already have.
Well, thanks, Dan. Appreciate the introduction and being here today. Yes, I lead an SME called Renewable Parts, and we specialize in the supply chain. And the particular novel aspect of our business is precisely what you said, which is how do you reuse and return parts into the supply chain for operation. I think the good news is that big business has committed itself, has signed up to a net zero future. I think, candidly, everyone's now trying to figure out how they do that. And they need time and space to be able to work out the details of those plans. Sort of I liken it a bit like we're going to the moon by the end of the decade. We don't know how we're going to get to the moon, but we're going to the moon, ladies and gentlemen. And we're now using terms like decarbonising the supply chain. And that's great, because that's fundamentally what we're talking about here. It's how do we think about the life cycle of a wind turbine, not just the original equipment, i.e. designing and building it from day one. These structures are in the ground or in the sea for 30 years. And they're mechanical systems. They use parts, many parts. They wear out. So we're really understanding and thinking about aftermarket and parts usage and how you can remanufacture parts to return into services is what our business is about. And we're putting in a lot of investment into technology to be able to return those parts to service. We're barely scratching the surface. We've been at this now for probably 4 or 5 years. Modest numbers so far, 200 tons of carbon dioxide footprint reduction. And that's really fundamentally about avoiding virgin manufacture. How do you avoid manufacturing more parts in a linear procurement model? And the wind industry is young. You know, we forget we are growing at a rapid rate, ever bigger turbines, and a lot of the engineering resource is focused on new technology, bigger turbines, and how do we meet the capacity required for a net carbon future. But thinking about aftermarket and the parts in the aftermarket, so what I'm talking about here is the bill of material. If you look at a wind turbine, there are thousands of parts in a wind turbine. We know gearboxes and generators and transformers, high capex items are refurbished. But if you go through the whole bill of material, you start to see that a lot less is refurbished. So our business is focused in this area. How do we apply technology to deliver a greener, more sustainable, decarbonized supply chain? And you know, we work, our innovation partner is the University of Strathclyde. I liken them to the MIT of renewables in the UK. They're brilliant. They don't wallow in the theoretical side of academia. They very much focused on how do we apply this and deploy it into industry. So we work with Strathclyde to do that. As an SME, we are very lucky to enjoy grant funding or match funding. And really the key for our business is if we're not agile and fast, we're not relevant. So we do innovate fast. And I think sometimes in big business, because of their sheer inertia and their size, they may struggle to do some of the things that we can do as a small business. So really the fit or the collaboration that we seek is how do we work with big business in a small business way to bring new technology, new techniques, new ways of thinking to the supply chain, and ultimately achieve the same end goal that everyone else is seeking, which is to decarbonize the supply chain.
If a little bit controversial, your background's in aerospace, right?
It is, yeah.
So, I mean, this isn't massively new in other sectors, is it? What you're talking about is bringing something up, you know, in a highly safety-conscious environment.
Yeah.
You know, is kind of standard practice.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Dad. I spent 25 years of my life in aerospace, gas turbines. It may surprise your viewers to know that on a gas turbine engine, 80% of the engine is refurbished. You know, and safety is the number one consideration. So when you think of it through that lens, you realize, well, it's inevitable. It's just normal. Reading across those practices and that way of thinking to the wind industry is going to happen. The only question is when and how. And how much of a priority is this versus everything else that we've got to get done. And I think to some extent I talked about our immaturity as an industry still, but it is about priorities. And as we're building out the capacity, what engineering resource is left to think about the aftermarket and what we do there. And therefore, what I hope is that big business will collaborate with small business who's equipped to do some of these things. Whilst they're building and designing and developing ever bigger turbines, we can get on and look after the aftermarket and help them innovate in those areas. So yes, I mean, I think the analogy of aerospace is a great one. So often in life, it's not about reinventing the wheel, it's about applying the pieces which are relevant and deploying them in a way which works for the industry you're now in. And I don't claim for a moment that what we're doing is novel in that regard. Some of the things we're doing within wind is novel. And I, frankly, am reading across much of the things I learned there into wind and trying to make it work as quickly as we can.
So, I mean, last question for you, James, just in terms of like your focus is clearly the whole area of circular economy is and reuse and minimizing virgin manufacture, etc. absolutely taps right into sort of a core value of our industry, right? Because we're here to sort of, you know, deal with a climate emergency. It's what drives us. So it's obvious that it should be something that we should do more of, and we're keen to see more companies like yours develop. What do you think you get enough support from government to be able to help with that in terms of support, particularly around innovation and the technologies that you think you need? And I don't expect you to say yes.
Well, we could always do with more support and more money. Certainly, I would like that. No, I think government is engaged. Holyrood is very engaged. I can speak less so of Westminster. I'm further removed from that. We sort of talk about, if you want to access the right minister in Scotland, you get on carriage 1A between Glasgow and Edinburgh on the 9 o'clock train, and you'll find that person. I joke, but it's that type. Scotland is a smaller country where we can do things generally faster. But no, I think the critical thing to think about here is this is called by some the triple helix of government, industry, and academia working together. And I spend a lot of my time trying to join those dots up and to talk in a language which is clear and simple enough, but backed by data, which persuades people that this is about skills and jobs. This is about the carbon footprint reduction or the impact we can make. And this is about an economy within an economy. So I liken the remanufacture economy within wind as the emerging economy that I'm talking about. Every one of our components now that leaves our factory has a carbon footprint sticker on it, which essentially says to everyone, well, by buying this component, you've saved carbon footprint of this amount of kilograms. And these are relatively modest numbers, but the accumulation of those numbers is huge. And as I said at the very start, we've barely got started. And if you start to do some calculations and extrapolate this through a 30-year life cycle, and you look at the wear-out rates of parts through that period, a component can fail 4 or 5 times. That's not unusual. It's not designed for 30 years. The question we're trying to tackle here is, how do we go after the areas where we can make the biggest difference? And I would measure that in operational disruption, environmental impact, and cost, or reducing waste. So really it's about talking a language which cuts through and people understand simply, and then they can get behind it. And we do want that whole idea of government, industry, and academia working together. And if we can do that, then I think we can really start to move very quickly.
It's you triggered a thought. This is going to sound like a ramble, but it's. I was listening to a session earlier where someone was saying, look, we often talk about fixing the climate crisis with technology like levers we can pull and things we can do. And your example of the carbon sticker on the parts that leave your factory is affecting the system. It's affecting the behaviours. It's affecting the human aspect, because there's a decision process that you go through. And I want to draw a parallel, which was over there in the blue zone, where all of the food on offer has a carbon rating. And I honestly found myself changing my decisions as a result of seeing that data in front of me.
Yeah.
And I think if we could make that more human in everything that we're doing in the decisions that we make, then I think we'll start to change behaviours.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Dan. I think this is about a cultural shift and change. This is about procurement moving from linear to circular. Decisions have habitually been taken based upon price. And when I think about how we interface with big business, it would ordinarily be through the procurement chain, who focus heavily on price. And I think that there are other legs to the stool now, and there's obviously an operational leg, there's a technical leg in terms of the quality of the product, but the fourth leg to the stool now is the sustainability leg. And what I'm looking for in big business is for them to say, hang on, how we make decisions and what we choose to do is driven by all of those factors, not just the original ones that we set up.
Thanks, James. It's really interesting, just whole area, and I think it kind of brings us into a bit more of a conversation. And I wanted to ask sort of the panel and everyone really for their views on just the UK as a place to do business, and in our industry, are we really leading the pack? Are we showing exemplar behaviour with the lights of the world's media on Glasgow at the moment? Do you think how do you think we stand and we rank? And we've all talked about what we're all doing well. Where do you think we can do better, and and maybe I'll come to you, Grant, first, maybe to kick us off. And
Yeah,
then please do chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of deployment, we've got a really good track record, but others are snapping at our heels now, and the government. So I liked your analogy in terms of academia, government, businesses of all sizes working together, and that's really the crossroads we stand at now. The government have to take a lead in terms of policy. They have to put policies in place which give confidence to invest. Where we have the confidence to invest, we know there's a stable environment, the investment will flow, and then that supports the supply chain. What there's a risk we do at the moment is we are planning policies that push the heights of turbines down. We can't keep, the supply chain is moving off in other directions, and we've got schemes that can't be built. There's no parts to buy in the market that do that. So there is a real crossroads in terms of how that policy starts to catch up to the challenge of the climate emergency, which is about scaling up and going much faster. Where we've got a great track record over the last 20, 30 years, but now we've got an awful lot more to do and a hell of a lot less time to do it in.
If I can sort of maybe throw a little challenge out, it's like that the triple helix you were talking about before is sort of predicated on this idea that we'll collaborate between various different parts of the ecosystem. But the fact is that in order to build in this country, we've got to compete, and we've got to compete hard to be able to get the projects that we're developing away. So when it comes to the decisions that you might make, like the things that Sam was talking about before, but really focusing on nature and taking this project and doing everything you can do, is there a risk that because of the way we've designed the market, we go, well, actually, I can't afford that because I need to be competitive? Is that a consequence?
For me, there's a huge risk if you're spending 10 years trying to consent a project. You've just got far less energy and resource to put into the opportunities that exist around that project. So the EIA process sits alongside the planning process, and that to me should be all about opportunities that exist. It shouldn't be the administrative comfort blanket that it's become, 700 pages that go in a cupboard somewhere at the end of the process. There should be opportunity and legacy, and it should be focused on the positive aspects of the things that come out of that scheme. But what we tend to do is focus on a very defensive system that we have at the moment. So
it's more stick than anything else.
Yeah, policy seems to be all about how not to rather than how to. And if we could turn things round so there was much more focus on the positive and the encouraging of the positive legacy, it would feel much more positive all round.
Yeah.
I was going to say that I feel the UK is on the development on onshore, but clearly on the development on offshore. It is a flagship country all around the world. Everybody has looked into they would like to mirror into the development of offshore wind in the UK. I think it may be also the strategy of early engagement with communities and the way it is processed. I think it is more natural to digest by the community. But I also agree that on the way forward, there were some targets up until now. We are looking ahead, and I think for the good, we got crazy about the figures that we will have to develop and install by 2050. And hopefully, if something positive comes out from behind us, there could be more clear targets. But for me, I think that currently, and even with the electricity debate that we are living currently, there has to be a debate about how to deliver on a competitive way, because there may be some voices already being raised about renewables being expensive or the price of the transition. So we have to, I think maybe with the three helix of academia, government and industry, we have to re-educate the social community. Okay, this is the transition, this is the price, but we have to stop here, because the name transition is because it starts in a date and it ends in another one. We cannot be in an energy transition until 2100. That is not a transition, that is a century.
Yeah.
So we have to put some prices, some competitiveness, and just trigger the whole industry And I would say also the investors, because you are an investor when going to the Blue Pavilion and buying either fish and chips or broccoli, which is expensive, which is less expensive, and which has more CO2. By the way, on the example, fish and chips is more expensive and it has more CO2 than broccoli. But I mean,
But it's great though, isn't it?
It is great. I took it today. But on top of that, I think that investors have already proven that it is more profitable, and they are the ones triggering, let's say, and accelerating the transition. So, as a conclusion, in a nutshell, I think that we have to re-educate and work together with government, because the private sector, we are ready to deliver.
And I think, John James, you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to it's a bit of a continuation of that and government intervention. So for me, the thing I think about a lot is skills. We're not talking about trivial things here. We're talking about complicated engineering systems. We found that it is difficult to get some of the skills that are needed to do the things that we want to do. And we have to create the environment. Government has to be a big part of creating that environment where we can train up the new generation of people coming through, interesting them in these types of areas. Engineering in the UK has typically suffered. We are not naturally an engineering or manufacturing-based economy. So my lobbying is directed in several areas, but one I spend a lot of time on is skills, and how do we use elevated skills to drive the innovation and technology we need. We are not a low-cost economy. We're not a metal-bashing economy. We've got to use that technology to drive performance improvements. And I think that if we can do that, then there's a win-win-win. There's a win to the environment. Things perform better and last longer. There's a win to jobs and skills because you create those new areas. And I think fundamentally the systems will be less costly to operate. It's the sort of price versus value type argument that we all know.
I'm struck by this point about re-education and the sort of the challenge in some ways that we have in renewables, because our cycle of innovation is so much quicker than any of us probably expected. And you know, from a developer point of view, or from even, I mean, I dare say, Alan, one of the first questions you had to ask when you're doing marine spatial planning exercises, how big are these turbines going to be? Because, you know, the offshore turbines of 2010 are the onshore turbines of 2020, and actually sooner. And we've got planning laws and regulations and things that probably take about that amount of time to educate, to legislate, and to embed. If we keep going that fast, we're going to always be constantly playing catch up, and that kind of cycle of innovation and education needs to be ongoing, right? Otherwise, I mean, how do you find that sort of in practice? Well, how big? You know, you must have gone to a planning officer and said, I'm bringing this project, and then you go back a year later and say, I'm bringing another project, and you go, what's happened here?
Yep, and that's the battle. Is you start that the very front of the process is engagement with the communities, and by the time you get to the, you know, today's panel is excellent, because it's really inspiring to see Sam at the very start of a project wandering about in the landscape looking for where to put it, the planning process, the engineering of it, the building and the construction, through to the reuse of the things on site. But as you go right back to the very beginning of that process, the conversations you have are out of date within a year. You know, and I can imagine for the supply chain itself, you potentially have a whole generation of products that never see the light of day because the planning process takes so long to get through. We lose credibility to the communities we speak to because we have to go back with something else, and that's seen as kind of, you know, a lie in terms of the process. But yeah, we need to make that process be more efficient, and we need to get through it quicker, and we need to understand what the supply chain's doing that is driving the development in the first place. So.
And there's another dimension to that, which I mean, I had one member company in turbine manufacturing say, well, not really focused on the UK as a market from an onshore point of view, because actually the turbines that we can sell are obsolete. We can't manufacture them competitively anymore because they're too, we've moved on. We've moved on, but UK planning law hasn't. So
this would be one of the key messages that that ended up in our key factors report with the World Bank around for emerging markets to really consider when on the outset of the journey towards offshore wind. You've got to think it is a long process. So as you can't drag your heels. You've got to get doing things now and as soon as possible. You can't wait 5 years and then hope that an offshore wind market just appears. There's a whole host of supply chain and infrastructure upgrades and things you've got to consider, and how you're going to deliver that between to meet the various net zero targets across the globe. So that would be a key message to pass towards the emerging markets.
It's interesting, Tils. I heard somebody speaking recently about the limiting factor on these things is going to be the ability to move parts around and lift and hoist parts around rather than how big you can physically build something. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where we get to.
And I'm sure we'll innovate our way beyond that.
Yeah.
So we make things more modular and smaller, so it's built on site and things like that. That could
I think that's quite an interesting aspect there in terms of the sheer scale and size of these things now. What it tells me is as you move through the operating life of the asset, the things you need to do to it need to be done in situ. You can't move them thousands of miles to somewhere else. There are certain aspects you can. So therefore where you get to quite quickly is you need to have regional hubs or centres that can manage the assets that are there in situ, because the carbon footprint of moving them around to somewhere else is considerable. Not just the logistical challenge of getting them, it's the actual weight of these things is huge. So we have to think about these as being not just static things that are built on day one and then just generate power. Of course they do, but it's that whole intervention through the life to improve their performance, because we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how do we improve the performance, how do we make them less carbon intensive as well through that bit. Because the technology will have in 10 years, 20 years, will be dramatically advanced than where we are today. And when you think about a turbine being designed, the design point before it actually goes into service might be 5-7 years before it actually turns for the first time. So when you think about those time periods, the opportunity to step in and do better things because we've moved forward in technology is vast, and that's an entirely different way of thinking. The challenge we have as an industry, I think, today is because the challenge that is in front of us is one of capacity and scaling up so rapidly, and I think everyone stares at these numbers and thinks, how the hell are we going to do that? How we challenge the through life aspects of the assets is a second order issue, I feel, versus building the systems and the infrastructure to meet the energy demand or the that government has laid out. So those are two big challenges we need to get our head around. A lot of the focus is on the first at the moment, understandably, but the other is not that far behind.
And being the two challenges, I think that when I was referring to the education 5.0 or 6.0, I don't know how to call it, it is also because we have been focusing, and we should be still focused in LCOE, being competitive, because LCOE is the driver for businesses and for profitability. But I think that being in a regulated sector, energy sector, I think that the speed of innovation is incredible. So and currently, because of the different electricity pricing and the debate that we are holding, I think that the community has realized that we are a geopolitical asset. Energy is crucial. So we are not only about costs. This is an asset to a country. The value that we contribute with the triangle, I mean, all the jobs that we create, not only in manufacturing, but in academia, in digitalization, in operational maintenance, in civil works. I mean, the multiplying effect of the whole industry, not only from green energy delivery, rather than from reinventing the wheel of the whole society, I think it's extremely impactful. And this is where I think that we, as private companies, but also governments in the triangle, we have to work together in re-educating people and making them cautious about how much we are contributing to society, how much we are giving back from what we are being paid. And I'm not talking about climate emergency. That is, of course, the common goal we have. I'm talking about economics, the economic rationale of the just people walking on the pedestrian. I mean, how they feel that we are contributing and the government may be contributing.
And there's something around how these new markets, when they're looking at developing offshore wind, the first projects are going to be more expensive, you know, because they're learning, they're building the infrastructure and they're getting things in place. But they've got to have that longer view that the economic benefits are there as the multipliers effects scale up and the projects get built out across the industry.
And we are talking about wind, but we haven't started to talk about green hydrogen. I mean, new developments that are going to be, ideally, they are going to be bringing to 100% renewable scenario, and still so much to do on top of sustainable components, and we have to invent the wheel.
Yeah.
In that, a new wheel has to be the wheel.
Yeah, there are some new wheels. We've already decided that green hydrogen is the last wheel in the equation, but we haven't quite figured out how that's going to be done. But I think we can accept that challenge. I think, you know, maybe sort of drawing to a close, but coming back to the point that we're talking about, you know, how do we develop renewables in harmony with people and nature, and that sort of key point. I liked your point. I liked John's comment about this is a transition. It's got to have a beginning and it's got to have a destination. At some point, the clock has to stop ticking. So maybe just as a bit of a cheeky question, and just as a way for everybody to close. If we think about where it started, talking about polling, and that 70%, more than 70% of people are you know, supportive, that still means there's like 20-something% of people, 30% of people who need to be convinced. So paint us a picture, maybe each of you, of when that energy transition is finished, how are their lives going to be better? How is their environment going to be better? Why should they, instead of be part of the 20%, become part of the 70%? And maybe Sam, I'll start with you on that.
Oh gosh,
That's a bit of a cheeky one, I know. But.
I guess my immediate vision is of, you know, a city with that's generating and storing everywhere throughout its part, a landscape around it that's rewooded, where the carbon storage is happening because the peatland is healthy, where the woodlands are growing, not the city landscape I walked through this morning, where all I could hear was chainsaws and there were trees being chopped down absolutely everywhere, but you know, an environment where people are really understanding carbon, I suppose, understanding how energy generation needs to be part of our life, but has to be done in a way that's sustainable.
I probably should have come to you last. John.
If I would say that, I mean, I have been in the sector for 18 years, so first of all, I would try to just pollute all these 20-30% with my passion about the sector. I mean, they must think that we are people. We are also, I mean, we are like them. I mean, we may be working in the green sector, but we are also humans. I could say that the energy security, integration, I mean, from a geopolitical perspective, no volatility in electricity prices. Also the impact on health from a carbon footprint standpoint. And if we may draw the ideal PowerPoint slide, it would be with electric vehicle, offshore, onshore, solar panel, storage, green hydrogen. I mean, we will be living on an average, we will be just depending on our own, with higher interconnections, in a more alliance and collaborative way, new developments in academia. So yeah, and the sun and blue sky. That could be my picture in the.
I don't think you should promise that to the good people of Scotland.
But volatility in pricing, for example, it is also that is crucial. I mean, as long as you have storage, you have renewables, you can control the demand side market developments. I think it could be much more secure and much cleaner.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Alan?
Yeah, so there's a variety of things, of course. The first ones come to mind, like health benefits, cleaner air, just general benefits, reduce pollution, and the things you mentioned about energy security. But something that kind of is a challenge, and internally I see it within our company and across the country and probably across the globe. It's about the transition of people into this green sector and the jobs that need to be created, and the part of it's the education of the people, but people already have a lot of expertise that can bring to the sector as well. So I think when people have there's a lot of benefit that can be seen across the economies due to job creation and getting people involved, and then that, if they're involved in the sector, then hopefully they'll become less of those 20% of the people and more hands-on and into the transition themselves.
And is there anything in especially given your work in marine spatial planning and offshore at the moment, where someone might sit there and think, well, goodness me, all of these wind turbines being put in the sea, what's the impact on the seabed and marine life, mammals? Is there anything there where you think, you'd say to them, well, look, there are other benefits as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we touched on it before about the having some maybe capacity within the ESIA process where you can implement net benefits to this. And it's happening already across the industry, and it probably can improve quite rapidly over the coming years, about being able to persuade people that some of these structures in the sea can be positive introductions to the seabed around biodiversity and creating feeding areas for sea creatures and things like that. So and there's other processes around mitigating construction process risks and interference, and it comes down to that careful marine spatial planning from the outset, and then those the processes that go into managing that throughout the life of the project.
Yeah, I just think it's one of those things that doesn't come across enough in the offshore world. That actually there's so much discussion about environmental net gain and how do we not just mitigate the impact of the wind farm, but also sort of help improve the nature as a consequence of the development. So, Grant, what are your thoughts?
I probably reflect firstly on how far we've come in a relatively short period of time. It wasn't so long ago we were the lunatics on the fringes of society. But yeah, look at us now.
Still lunatics, just not on the fringes.
Yeah. But so, and maybe the final thing I'll reflect on is kind of you can't please 100% of the people 100% of the time, and maybe what I prefer to focus on is the majority that we're doing this for, and more importantly, the happy children make happy parents. So that's the generation that we should be focusing on, making a real change for the next generation that come along. And I can guarantee, I've seen the evidence of the past week that will certainly be a lot smaller percentage as the next generation comes through.
That's a really, really sort of important reflection about the children. I took my kids to Dynamic Earth at the weekend, and there was a big climate change exhibition on, and they were so engaged in it. They're only 5 and 7, but they absolutely lapped up the information, and they care, and it's filtering into young children really at that age already. And so I'll give the final word to you, James.
It's a big question you posed there, Dan. W.B. Yeats said, that you know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I think there's a lot in that when you really think about that statement. This is about value. This is about awareness and education about what are we actually doing. The awareness has gone up. I'm more optimistic than your 70%. I think if you went out there on the street and says, do you want to be greener or more environmentally responsible, I think more people than that would say that. I hope so. So this is about giving them a path to behaving in a greener way and making it easier. It's been said that the green choice should be the easy choice. money's going to start flowing, is flowing dramatically towards renewables. So the whole capital system, if I put it that way, is moving in this direction. The yields are better. It's a better, the more responsible thing to do. I think it's a combination of a whole raft of things. I mean, you talked about food labelling. I think that's really important. You know, we know food's a huge part of this. The carbon footprint on where that piece of beef or whatever came from and what it required to do was. That's about education, awareness, placing that fact or information in someone's hands. They can make an informed decision. I think clothes. We should be reusing clothes. You know, I spoke to someone the other day, he says, I lease my jeans. Never heard of that one before. I lease my jeans. Or who uses it last week? No, I do it over 6 months. Okay, that's interesting. So that's a mindset shift in terms of how we behave. And I think it should be something that makes us feel better. So you know, I got quite parochial there earlier on about the world I'm in. I know when my work's done, when the first question the procurement department asks is, no, I want to know where the circular economy solution is, not the cheapest price. And I'm being a little bit glib there, but I think it's illustrative of the mindset shift. This is a way we lead our lives, and we should want to enjoy a less carbon intensive way of leading them. So whether it be through food, whether it be through your transportation, whether it be by getting on a plane less often and going on a holiday to wherever, these are all choices, and it's the accumulation of that. And you know, I think people want to know that their energy source is green, and they want to be informed that they're making the best choices they can make at this point in time. And those choices will get better. I mean, I use the analogy of the blue bin outside the house. 10 years ago, there were no blue bins, right? You just put your garbage out. You know, you couldn't imagine putting your plastic waste into the black bin liner now. So these are shifts in societal behavior. And I think it's accelerating, and I'm very optimistic. I feel COP and you know, the speeches I've heard during COP have really been very uplifting on the whole. And I think we will surprise ourselves within 10 years how far we've come. I think it will be much, much further than people believe it is today. But it's the old aggregate of incremental things, isn't it? It's not one big bang. It's a lot of things happening together.
I think that's a really positive, optimistic way to end. I think the reflection I have of COP has been about behaviour. Lots of very important statements made. Some will say it's not enough. We'll hear, you know, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, provided that it's low carbon, of course. But ultimately, you know, just lots of small things around the way the conference has been organised that you can see with, you know, the use of carbon labelling on the food, the elimination of single-use coffee cups, just that kind of instilling behaviour is making people think twice. And I think when it comes back to our subject for today, it shows you just the vast array of areas where we're impacting, whether it's developing an energy park, which has given somewhere green spaces for them to go outside around a power station, which would have been unthinkable, you know, a generation ago, to thinking about how we take care of our marine environments and develop sensitively and make a positive impact on the marine environment, whether it's to restoration of peatlands, or whether it's recycling of technologies or sustainable supply chains, or developing a circular economy within our own sector. There's an enormous amount that we are doing, and there's an enormous amount more that we can do. So with that, I'll thank you for listening, and thank my panel for taking part. Thanks very much indeed.